I'm Becky Quick of CNBC and your host of The Forum. I'll be guiding you through exclusive conversations among some of the world's global leaders. Conversations previously held behind club doors, but today we invite you in. The Economic Club of New York serves as the premier forum for nonpartisan discussion dedicated to connecting the world's brightest minds with preeminent public and private sector leaders. A nonprofit 501c3, the club is a 115-year-old platform for the conversations that help shape the future of our world. The Economic Club of New York, brightest minds, critical conversations, catalyst for innovation.
Just thinking about when you took the reins as CEO, 2017. Now, not everyone looks at the charts as much as I do, and I'm sure you never spend a moment looking at the share price, but the fact that it has tenfolded under your leadership, and of late it has been just an extraordinary time for us all to be discussing, and attention completely ripped, whether it's AI on one side, but ultimately, suddenly we're talking about GLP-1s or GIPs, and none of us quite know what it stands for, but we do know is it seems to be a cure for not only just, obesity, but they're having profound effects on heart, on liver, on all parts of ultimately the way in which we can be driving our health. And I just want to understand with Mounjaro, with Zepbound, how much you feel that the oxygen is being sucked out of the room of just all this obsession with this new breakthrough that you have been helping drive.
It's difficult to go to cocktail parties these days without getting one sip in and a question about weight loss drugs, GLP-1. What is GLP-1? People say it without knowing it, as you said, GIP and so forth. And that what an honor that is to have such a interesting invention that can augment so many people's lives. So, we've been working in this space for a very long time. Yeah. That's probably not well recognized. We licensed our first GLP-1, we partnered it with a company called Amylin in 2003. We launched the drug in 2005. It was a twice-a-day injection, and it wasn't very good, but it was the first GLP-1 drug. So I like to talk about this as sort of a 20-year overnight success. Most of the appreciation of that has come in the last 18 months, but kind of what we do well, and I think underappreciated part of our industry is the time and energy it takes to create so-called breakthroughs. In some ways, the industry showed a lot of prowess during COVID, and we're very proud of that. But viral pathogens are really easy to conquer. Human disease that's more metabolic, or cancer, which is innate, or immunity, are much harder. And that sort of taught everyone that if we just put enough money and attention on something, we could fix it in a year, right? But that's not how most diseases work, and not how obesity works. But through the years we iterated and we found new things. Mostly that what was a drug designed for blood sugar control, that if we could give it at higher doses, you saw pretty profound weight changes. And then our scientists in the early part of the 2010s noticed that if we put two of these so-called incretin family proteins, so as you're eating your salad, your stomach is sending proteins to the other parts of your body to say, I'm being fed right now. One of those is GLP-1, which really affects glucose signaling. Another is GIP, which affects fat metabolism. Right. And by putting them together in a mouse in 2010, we demonstrated that you would lose even more weight, and it tolerized as well some of the nausea that people experience with GLP-1 alone. So we went about designing that into a drug, which we did in 2014. And in 2016, I remember a phone call I got from our current chief scientific officer. He was in a different role at the time, saying, you have to see this data. We tried this medicine in like a dozen people in Singapore who were otherwise healthy, most of which had to drop out of the study because they lost so much weight, they needed to eat.
Oh my goodness.
So at that moment, I was like, okay, now we go as hard as we can.
And when you're trying to go as hard as you can, ultimately there is a sheer force of demand and limitations of supply. What does that look like right now? Because this is able to be consumed, to be used almost worldwide, but actually only a few markets you can actually get into at the moment.
Yeah, we've really only launched in 3 markets right now in a full form. We're working on expanding supply. In 2022, when we launched Mounjaro in the US, between Lilly and Novo combined, we probably made enough of this class of medicines for about 12 million people on the planet.
Just 12.
And 2 weeks ago, the WHO said there's 1 billion people with obesity. So we're a little short of the goal. We set about building new facilities. Novo has as well. They're buying companies, and we're partnering with other companies to expand. But interesting thing is, these are proteins, so they're a very specific kind of medicine that's complicated. And then we put it in an injectable system, which has to be, we can't purify, we can't assure that it's pure at the end of the process. We have to make sure the whole process is. So it's ultra clean room conditions, basically, to make it. And then we put it in a little injection device. That kind of system, probably in the whole world, 80% of the capacity is already controlled by Lilly and Novo. So there are not built sites to go buy or rent to make more. We have to make them ourselves. So we're doing that. We currently have 6 manufacturing facilities under production or being stood up. We had 14 before, so that's like a 50% increase. We'll probably have a few more by the end of the year announced. I mean, we're going as hard as we can. But capital is not the constraint. Time is the constraint. Those buildings take 3 or 4 years from announcement to come online. So right now in the US, there's frustration because there's shortages of these, but we haven't even introduced them in most of Europe or the world. So more to do. One project we're working on could change that, which is an oral solid. So it's not a protein, it's chemistry, and it's not in that injectable device, which is so difficult to make. It's a pressed tablet. The world is awash in those capacities. And so should the drug be successful, I think we'll be able to tap into quite a bit more supply, which will be good for the US, but even better for places like Brazil or Mexico or China, where actually most of the obese people on the planet live and where the biggest health difference can be made.
But ultimately, how are you seeing the limitations, the constraints, the way in which healthcare is served in the US, and indeed better or worse in other geographies that you're currently in, helping or hindering you getting it into the hands of the right people?
Yeah, I think it's no different than any other condition where we see those health inequities in the US are built into the system. It's not about the medicine, it's more how the system works. So if you have, this is the best healthcare system in the world, it can also be one of the worst at the same time. Our system's complicated, it's diffuse, and it's expensive. So people who have trouble with accessing healthcare have trouble accessing these obesity medications. The federal government themselves have said that we're not reimbursing these in Medicare. So for seniors, that makes terrible sense because the one part of the system that has at least a notion of sort of some functional dynamics, and we can spend a lot of time on healthcare if you like, is the federal government, because they have the opportunity to provide preventative care, and they are the payer of last resort anyway.
Yeah.
So they have the most to gain by preventing disease. There was a moment of insight where they finally agreed in the Part D program that seniors use to pay for all vaccines with no out-of-pocket. It took COVID to get them to do that, but that's what they do now. That'll be a really wise investment for our country, for our taxpayers, and certainly for the health of seniors. In a lot of ways, obesity is kind of a parallel thing. The top 3 spenders for Medicare, which are heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, all are augmented by obesity. Yet the federal government doesn't pay for obesity drugs for seniors. Now, private companies do. Currently, about half of covered lives in America in the commercial markets have access to these medications with various constraints and steps and so forth. Some companies require 3 months of diet and exercise. Some require you to stay on them longer so you get the full benefit. That seems rational. But half don't. And as you might guess, like those that do, or it's like about the wage scale. So we have a lot of banks in the room, bankers, I'm sure. Probably the banks pay for these drugs because we're well compensated in banking. But does Walmart pay? No. Do automakers? No. So I think that's like an obvious inequity, right? Is that it's not and that's true across all of commercial insurance. Medicaid, even worse.
I can imagine in this election cycle that we're basically already in, drug prices are going to come up, and it feels as though everyone turns to you and say, well, what are you doing about it? Ultimately, can you educate us a little bit about how this needs to go hand in glove with the federal government? How much realistically you can do your side, and how much we can see done from the other side to ensure that the right people are able to access it at the right price?
Yeah, so we're used to this topic. It's a popular one. Drug pricing in the US is a problem. I would agree with that. But what the problem is, we don't agree on with a lot of politicians. So first of all, healthcare in the US is the most expensive system in the world. We spend 17% of our GDP on healthcare. That's about 5 points higher than high spending European countries. But drugs make up only 11% of the total. In your home country, drugs make up 15% of the total. In France, it's almost 20. So actually, the reason that healthcare is expensive has very little to do with medicine.
Right.
We spend less proportion on medicine than the average in the OECD. What do we spend it on? Well, a lot of salaries. So compensation is very good. I don't hear politicians saying we should pay our cardiologists like the French cardiologists. Why? Because we wouldn't have any cardiologists if we do that. We don't use that same logic for drugs, but literally if we paid for Mounjaro what the French do, we would never have Mounjaro. And the French probably will never have Mounjaro as a result, right? So there is an access and availability that we take for granted because we have it. But if we want to change the cost of it, we won't, because to produce these miracles, it takes resources. The third point is about coverage. We conflate what patients pay out of pocket with what the cost of the system is. And as I just said, the cost of the system is not extreme in the US. I can make a good argument we should spend more on drugs. But the out-of-pocket cost to people is quite variable and often quite high. Americans pay more than most OECD countries out of pocket than the rest of the group. Really only in China and India do you have scaled economies where there's so much out-of-pocket costs for patients. And we'd agree, those aren't as developed as the US. Most developed countries, out-of-pocket costs are low. Take France. In France, the average out-of-pocket for a prescription for a month is €5. In the US, it's over $100. So that's what people are experiencing. That's creating the political energy. And that's about insurance coverage, which we allow to be worse in our country. Why? I don't know. But if you go to the hospital, 95% of your costs are paid by insurance. If you buy a medicine, it's typically less than 80%. So we over-subsidize hospitals, we under-subsidize drugs. I don't understand why. I don't run the insurance system, but that's how it's evolved. We can change that.
Would you like to be a part of the conversations at the Economic Club of New York? Learn more about membership, the New York City and National Fellows programs, and other opportunities for engagement in the club at www.econclubny.org.
Yes, it's wonderful that these drugs that you have put so many decades of work into are not only being applicable to weight and obesity, which is now called, of course, a disease and not just something that one chooses as a lifestyle, but it's also helping, as we said, liver, heart. Where else would you like everyone to be talking about, though, as well? Because we know you all for the work you're doing on Alzheimer's, for the work you've been doing on cancer, for the work on autoimmune. I mean, I've got a father with ulcerative colitis. That's something I particularly care about. How much are you able to take this incredible success story and start really funneling into the R&D element of things?
Well, we always have kind of done that. I think, in the nature of industry is you have these asymmetrical rewards, these blockbusters, and they fund all the other failures, but also a number of drugs that aren't quite as successful, but are really valuable to one person or another, right? We always start with the idea that we work on, and I think a Lilly is for this kind of thing, work on hard, tough diseases that affect a lot of people.
Yeah.
A lot of the drugs we read about in the last 10 years have been about drugs that make a big difference in tough diseases for a few people. And sometimes we end up there. But our goal is mostly to work on scaled problems. So we're doing that, and we select therapeutic spaces to do that in, where we have a lot of expertise. I think we can invest, given our size and our history, through the ups and downs of science, which are inevitable. And we talked about these GLP-1s. I mean, again, it's been 20 years, and it's an overnight success, right? it's because we invested that whole way. Alzheimer's is an even more dramatic story. I mean, that's 35 years we've been investing there.
Yeah.
Still waiting for our first FDA approval.
Were you frustrated by that? Because it came as a surprise that you're having to do more work.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, surprises are frustrating. But as I said to my team that day, we've been working on this for 35 years. I don't think a few more months is going to make that big of a difference. People are waiting for that solution. It's our job to deliver it. There's questions. It's a serious condition. The drugs are serious, and they're not always safe in everybody. We need to have that conversation with the FDA and with the public. I think it's healthy.
It's the concern around brain swelling.
Yeah, exactly. Which isn't, not everyone's afflicted by this, but a single-digit percentage are, and doctors and people care about that. We should invest the time to explain it. I think that's fair. But there's an example where we've invested over a huge amount of time, mostly failed. Each time we failed, we learned something. Sometimes you fail and you have no idea why. You should stop, I think. But if you fail and you learn something, and it's a serious condition that only something like a Lilly can produce a solution for, that's when we keep going. And I do think, as we look ahead, speaking of neurodegenerative conditions, we're in the golden era of metabolic health right now.
Yeah.
Because we have great solutions. We just need to make more volume. I think the next decade will be about neurodegeneration, which are, of course, Alzheimer's the most common condition, but Parkinson's, ALS. I think these are becoming tractable problems, and we're in a good position to make a big difference in those spaces. And they're terrible, frightening conditions that nobody wants. So prevention is really what we should be going for. And I'm particularly excited about the difference Lilly can make there. You mentioned autoimmune disease, also very common. There's over 200 autoimmune diseases. The biology is very complex, but we're beginning to unwind it. And I think we're entering a period where we could have a number of new drugs for both small or diseases that affect a few people, but also broadly, like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, that could really move from treatment, symptom remission, to actually disease remission. Wow. And I think that's where you can take a medicine on and off, and you don't have to worry about the condition. So that's a future we see there. Of course, cancer, every drug company is involved in cancer. It's, again, a frightening condition. It's probably 200 diseases or more. So it's a complicated space. Breakthroughs are made in individual diseases within that 200 basket. But we don't have yet common things like we do with obesity, where now we can address metabolic health broadly. So a lot more work to do there. Although some, terrible cancers are now basically chronic diseases already. Prostate, many lymphomas, breast cancer. People can live decades after diagnosis, and in my lifetime that happened. So I think we need to keep investing and keep working on this, and with partners in the health community. But that's a hard one. But again, that's what a Lilly's for, is keep working on those tough problems.
You've been listening to The Forum by the Economic Club of New York, a nonprofit 501c3 dedicated to connecting the world's brightest minds for critical, nonpartisan conversations. Be sure to subscribe now to be alerted to future new episodes. Would you like to be a part of the conversation at the Economic Club of New York? Learn more about membership, the New York City and National Fellows programs, and other opportunities for engagement in the club at www.econclubny.org. I'm your host, Becky Quick. Thanks for listening.